So there we go. All right, I have it set up now on my end. In our first space, we went over the first chapter of Wang Bi's work, Laozi WeiZhi LueLi. This space is just going to be the second chapter. I think I mentioned it before, but this book has been organized into 6 different sections. The first section and the second section are about the same length. It was over 2 hours last time, so I expect this will be the same again. Sections 3, 4, and 5 are much shorter. So I'll do this each Monday. It seems to be working well. But next week and the 2 following, it'll be much shorter. And then section 6, the last one, is the longest of them all. And then that'll be it. We'll have gone through this whole text by Wang Bi, as translated by Rudolf Wagner, and as organized by him into these 6 sections. Although I have the Chinese here, so we can always, pull sections of it like we did last time if there's anything that really interests us. You guys can, some of you were in that first part, and if you weren't, you can go look at a recording or listen to a recording of it. But I'll just quickly recap. That way, we've been doing other things for the last week, and so make it fresher in your mind. But I gave a sort of a historical overview of Wang Bi at first. Again, he's, a 3rd century Chinese thinker. I said he was contemporary with Plotinus. The Chinese world was very chaotic during his life. The Han Dynasty had just collapsed. All the scholarly institutions, the funding for it, the state funding, it's gone, they collapsed. And Wang Bi himself is sort of a young aristocrat, I suppose. His whole family is sort of a strong intellectual and political reputation. He knows all the biggest scholars. He died very young, sort of a prodigy. So sort of just imagine, I don't know if you know any examples in your own life, but every so often you meet someone who's sort of like the golden boy or child or prodigy who is intellectually very promising and also has managed to form connections with, older scholars who are really well respected. And it's sort of an interesting dynamic, and it gave rise to a lot of these really interesting texts, one of which we're reading. So basically an aristocratic child prodigy who's linked up with all of the best scholars of his day, and academia has basically collapsed. So it's a Wild West in terms of intellectual tradition. He gets referred to as a xuanxue scholar, or study of the dark or study of the mysterious. Xuan. There are other thinkers in this category. It's not like he is the only one, or that they're all in agreement. But they're basically all, to some degree, interested in discussing metaphysics or the context or system behind all of the obvious things that you can touch or see. So that's kind of why they're the study of the dark or the study of the mysterious. It's this background or system behind everything that's not so obvious and can't be when you start to describe it, you lose hold of it in a sense, because if I start describing to you an apple, I've kind of excluded oranges, right, from the picture, and so you lose part of it. But he sees this sort of mysterious thing that he doesn't want to describe in too much detail, lest he make it too particular or lose it. It's not supposed to be something very clear and obvious. I see a requested mic. Yeah, here you go, 3D. You've got the mic. Do you have anything to add, 3D, or just requesting the mic in case you want to do later?
I just have a question. It seems to me like this is a fairly robust position, right? Like anytime you use language and you describe particulars, right, you are abstracting away from this universal, and that seems like a fairly robust position. But at the same time, someone like Hegel would say that, how do you know that that this universal is really, or the absolute in Hegelian terms is really beyond all possible description? Maybe eventually we will get to the point where we will have the right tools to identify it and classify and differentiate through language and and mathematics and whatever else. But we're just not there yet. But maybe we will be, right? So.
That's an interesting point. I can't pretend to know much about Hegel, but on that specific point you raised, how do we know that it's beyond, or they may call it subtle or dark or mysterious and the like? You remember? I'll do a recap of the first chapter. I believe you're in that space as well, so you may well remember this section as well.
I was, yeah.
Yeah, but he talked about how this source is giving rise to or sustaining hot and cold, right? And the different musical notes. And he said, if we define it as hot, then to that extent, it couldn't make anything cold. It's not cold, right? And if we define it as a particular note on the musical scale, and that's what defines it and the sound that it makes, then it can't really give rise to the other sounds, because it's so defined by that one particular sound to the exclusion of the others. And so, and again, not being knowledgeable about Hegel, this, I think, is the basis of, or at least part of the basis of why he's distinguishing it from, say, a particular note, or from the hot, or from the cold, because it has to be something that can give rise to both sides of that hot-cold dichotomy. It has to be something that can sustain or give rise or give some sort of context to all the different notes and not favoring any one of them, because if it did favor, it would exclude. And so that's part of at least why we can't be using this specific language of specificity, not because we don't have an instrument for it. And I think a common example we might use today in speaking about the world is we'll say there's sort of a system, and then there's all the particulars in the system. Like, we have the rules of chess, and then we have all the way the pieces can move. And the rules of chess don't really favor a particular move. They're not something you would detect with an item that you would use to pick up, the signs of a chess piece on a board, like a measuring tape or something. So I think it's closer to that sort of distinction than what that quote from Hegel might have been, or that idea from Hegel might have been about. Is that sort of what you were getting at, 3D?
Yeah. That's more or less, yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So I'll just, seeing as we just started to recap the first chapter, I'll just recap it quickly. It began with the claim that all things and all their achievements are created by something, right? And then he thought that this creating source was some mysterious other. It's not like a table creates the chairs, or, a bird creates other animals. Like, these particular things we can see and touch create the other things we see and touch. Rather, it's something that is not a table, is not a chair, is not a particular object at all. It is featureless and nameless, and something that is, somehow distinct from what we touch and see directly, and can give rise or sustain opposites like hot and cold, as we were just saying now, 3D. Then, after pointing this out, that he's trying to identify something beyond a particular that we can touch and see, he kind of goes into attempts to describe what it could be like. He uses terms like featureless and nameless. And if it is to create and sustain all the different particulars that we can see and touch, it can't really be defined by any of them. Like we were saying, 3D, it couldn't be defined by the hot, because hot and cold are opposites or mutually exclusionary for him. And so if this source or this mother and this sustaining force was defined as hot, how could it be said, how could we say that it's the source or the mother of the cold, right? It's sort of exclusionary of the cold. So it somehow has to transcend or go beyond or envelop that sort of dichotomy. Same for the musical notes. It can't be one particular note, because then it would lack the others, just like we were saying. So it has to be impartial or beyond, for fear of not being able to be the mother of them all. And for Wang Bi, these things do have a mother or a source or a creator. And then he goes on, to develop it more. We checked the Chinese text for this, actually. It was a Bao Tong Tian Di. It kind of envelops and goes through heaven and earth. So in some sense, it's omnipresent and threaded through everything. And then he sort of shifted I think we find in a lot of these ancient Chinese texts, they always shift at some point to giving advice to an emperor or being more practical. So he shifts to how this mysterious source, A, could be most fully expressed in the world. Remember, he used terms that I believe are also in the DaoDeJing, like the great image and the great sound. And so after he expressed how this mother or this source could be most fully expressed or accorded with in the practical reality we live in, and then he went on to how an emperor could govern in accordance with it. So you remember he gave a bit of advice, and he's going to do more of that in the second chapter. But just in that first chapter, he's identified what he's really focused on here. He's done his best to bring out some details, and we spent 2 hours something discussing it last time of all these little details and how he reaches them. And then he switched tracks and said, when the world is a certain way, that mother or that beyond, the thing beyond, is best expressed in the world. And then how an emperor can govern or behave in a way that best accords with that. And, the world can be ideal, and he's not really forcing it. It's just he's understood the metaphysical reality, and he's understanding that metaphysics. He's now organized things in a way that the ideal situation just flows naturally. He doesn't need to force it. But that's a recap of chapter 1. And again, as we said at the start, if anyone's interested in going back, they can. We gave more information about the history back then and everything, so it's always good to go back. But with that, I'll just do as we did last time. I'll jump right into the text. So I'm going to start at section 1. I do have the English and Chinese up on the... I've heard it called a Jumbotron. I don't know if that's what Twitter actually calls it, but whatever Twitter calls it, it's up on the screen there at the top. And again, the book is by Rudolf Wagner. He's written a number of books about Wang Bi. I've read 3 of them, but this one is the one that actually has the text itself. It's called A Chinese Reading of the DaoDeJing, and it has both Wang Bi's Laozi WeiZhi LueLi, and it also has the LaoZi. So if you don't care about the general history or how to read these texts or a summary of them at all, you just want the raw text, then the book you want is a Chinese reading of the DaoDeJing. So starting with section 1 of the, what is it? It's like a DaoDeJing. So the second chapter. It is a fact that even the speed of racing lightning is still insufficient to go full round in one single moment. Advancing by riding on the wind is still insufficient to arrive in one single breath. As the Xi says about the spirit, to be good at being fast lies in not speeding. To be good at arriving lies in not going. Thus, the bloom of what Laozi calls that which can be spoken of is still insufficient to, in the Zhuangzi's words, administer heaven and earth. The maximum of that which has shape is still insufficient, in the Zhuangzi's words, to store the 10,000 kinds of entities. So I'll stop there, because there's a few interesting things to point out, and also a couple of points I can make to help us come to grips with that. I'll also, when I finish speaking, ask if anyone has questions or anything, just like I did last time. But firstly, you'll see that after 3 and before section 4, in the brackets, the square brackets, he says, as the Xi says about the spirit. That text, the Xi is it's an essay that gets appended to the Book of Changes. There's a whole bunch of essays that get appended there later. And in that book, obviously in the square brackets, so the Chinese does not actually directly reference it, but the author has referenced it because he thinks that the author, Wagner, has referenced it because he thinks it's necessary to understand how to, section 4 and 5. And so in 4 and 5 it says, to be good at being fast lies in not speeding. And 5 says, to be good at arriving lies in not going. Now, and the bracket said, as the Xi says about the spirit. So the spirit in that text is defined as not a particular thing or not anything. And that text that he's got in the square brackets there, I have a section from it. It says, being spirit, the sage is therefore able to be fast without speeding and to arrive without going. So you can see that quote from that text, which predates this Laozi WeiZhi LueLi, is it's very obviously either directly related to 4 and 5 or has directly inspired Wang Bi in some sense to come up with 4 and 5. So you can see why he cites it there. My interpretation or my understanding is essentially that by not being defined as a fast runner or a slow runner, someone kind of transcends that question and can reach everywhere at once. So, to be good at being fast lies in not, don't bother going fast or slow. And to be good at arriving means, not going anywhere in particular. You don't need to go anywhere in particular. There's some other secret of being fast and being wherever you need to be. And this is a pretty popular point to make in Taoist texts that I've read, or just texts in general that I've read from China. If you want to know what it kind of looks like or how to interpret that, how can you be fast if you're not defined as a fast person or a slow person? Or how can you arrive everywhere if you're not going anywhere? Like, what does that mean? And basically, what I see it meaning is that the people use a system of government or an institution to manipulate things, rather than running around and trying to do everything personally. So there's a lot of Chinese texts on rulership or how to govern, and with a lot of these similar observations. A ruler can walk a certain distance in a day. An emperor can ride a chariot. Let's say he's got his fastest charioteer, which is a pretty popular example, and he can ride a certain distance in a day. But by proper use of the government and proper use of the institutions, the state's chariots can go in all directions and cover the entire kingdom at once. And if you set up, and another example, you'll find this in, say, the Shangjun Shu, is if you set up a system of mutual punishments for people. So let's say the government organizes the population into family units and says, if a person commits a crime and he's caught, if he was reported by his fellow family members, the fellow family members will be rewarded and the person who was caught will be executed. And if the person who commits the crime is caught and the fellow family members or population unit members did not report him, they all get executed and nobody gets a reward. And so, that sounds very brutal today, but in the theory, all the people will police each other and the power of the law will reach everywhere. And the ministers are not really getting really hands-on. The minister doesn't have to run around to every household and see where people are misbehaving. And just like being able to send out the state chariots to all the different villages, the emperor doesn't have to personally run there. So with a proper functioning government, the emperor really can be everywhere and the law really can reach everywhere. And there is no real question of it being fast or slow. It's just sort of omnipresent and sees all and is everywhere. You might say, why do you want to do that? And different texts will give different reasons, but the one example I gave of the police state, they say the emperor should do that, so then he can just relax and enjoy his music and women in peace, while the machine of state is omnipresent and gets everything done naturally, without him having to, roll up his sleeves and do it himself, which would just exhaust an individual. So by not trying to be personally fast or strong, but instead focusing on something that transcends or envelops the whole state or the whole problem itself, you can kind of do everything always and immediately, which is beyond what you could do if you were trying to just brute force it by walking around and solving all the problems yourself. Another interesting note, we have number 7, and I think a lot of people here will know this one. You'll all appreciate this, because I think everyone, even if it was just like a Western Civilization 101 sort of thing, we've all read the DaoDeJing to some extent. So number 7 says, I'll do it without the brackets. It says, the bloom of that which can be spoken of is still insufficient to administer heaven and earth. And so, again, in a square bracket, he's referencing the LaoZi. LaoZi, again, like we said last time, it can mean DaoDeJing, or it could mean the person. He's in the square brackets, it's being treated as a person here. But why is it obviously a reference to LaoZi, and what do we mean by the quotation mark here? Again, quotation mark means he's citing a text, right? That which can be spoken of. Again, number 7. And if you go over to the Chinese here, what do we have? 故可道之声. Okay, so he has, well, 故 is just the thus, number 6. But the 可道 here. Everyone who has read just literally the first page of the DaoDeJing in a modern translation will remember that it begins something along the lines of, the Tao that can be Taoed is not the eternal Tao. And so what it says here in the quotation marks, that which can be spoken of, is actually just 可道. It's like the Tao that can be Taoed is the Tao 可道. So this is like that which can be spoken of is more like the Taoable or the walkable way or something. It's that Tao 可道. And that's why he's put it in quotation marks there. So I think it's interesting. The English, that which can be spoken of, that which can be done, or that way that can be walked. I get it. And I was just curious what the quotation mark was from. And it's the very first section of the DaoDeJing there. And then the last 2 characters I read were blooming or flourishing. So it's like the flourishing way that can be walked, or the flourished way that can be walked, or the flourished way that can be spoken of. What's the next part here? We got 为足以观天地. Okay, so it's not sufficient or for purpose of administering heaven and earth. Yeah. So it's basically, if you focus on not the mysterious or dark or beyond Tao, but rather just the practical things that can be done, like those particular practical activities, it will be insufficient to administer heaven and earth. And I think that is pretty much in line with what I was saying earlier, right? Like if a ruler has to think about running to each guard post or village to deliver messages, it's not going to be good enough to administer heaven and earth. It's not practical. You need a system that can organize and do something in a more, not naturalistic, but more in accordance with Taoist principles, where you understand the system or the backdrop and you can arrange things in a way that now, without you having to do very much, you will do everything. Does anyone have any comments on that? I just thought it was a good place to stop, because there's so many texts referenced in here and some interesting points that are maybe not so obvious, but are actually kind of very common in ancient Chinese texts, in my opinion. But if anyone has anything to say, feel free to request a mic or hand up. Otherwise, I will continue on. All right, I'll head on. We're going to go to section 9. What do we have here? All right, now I'll go to 20. That is why he who sighs in admiration for it is unable indeed to fully account for such a beauty. He who sings in praise of it is unable indeed to expound such a width. Giving it a name is unable to match it. Giving it a designation is unable to fully grasp it. A name necessarily has something that makes it specific. A designation necessarily has something on which it is based. Having a specification, there will, as a consequence, be something that is not included. Having a base, there will, as a consequence, be something that is not exhausted. There being something not included, the name, as a consequence, greatly deviates from its true essence. There being something not exhausted, the designation, as a consequence, cannot be taken as a name. This can be further clarified. Enclosed essay, Names and Designations. I sort of just read that section as almost fleshing out the idea that if you pick something out, you're excluding other things. So if you pick out a specific something, it's not the whole story. Which also goes back to 1 to 8, which we just read, which referenced the Dao Ke Dao, Ming Ke Ming sort of thing. A distinction between the particulars or identifying something as distinct from the eternal system. So a lot of the stuff here, like giving it a name is unable to match it. Giving it a designation is unable to fully grasp it. It's like, yeah, when you start limiting it, you won't get the whole, right? I don't know why at 20 the author has, not in square brackets, but in circle brackets, written enclosed essay, names and designations. That's not in the original text. And I don't recall, maybe I just, it's been a while since I read the whole book, but I don't recall there being an explanation of why he's written it that way. Maybe it's just his way of relating the next section that follows. But I don't see any footnote to it, and it's just kind of an odd thing to write there. But yeah, 9 to 20 was mostly just fleshing out an idea that had already been gone over. Just if you pick something specific out, you're excluding other things, and you're not really getting the eternal thing. And so whatever you're describing doesn't rise up to the greatest. But if anyone has any comments or anything, feel free to put a hand up or request the mic. Otherwise, I'll continue.
You're doing a great job. Keep going.
Thank you, Indigo. I'll just skip ahead to 21 then. It's not skipping ahead, that's where we stopped. And I'll read through to 27. So that should be in the same screenshot. It is a fact that Tao is taken for its aspect of being that on which the 10,000 kinds of entities are based. Dark is taken for its aspect of being that which lets the recondite emanate. Deep is taken for its aspect that, even when delving into the abstruse, in which according to the Xi-Tzu the yarrow stalks and tortoise shells excel, it is impossible to get to the bottom of it. Great is taken for its aspect that, even if one fills it in and rounds it out evermore, as the Xi-Tzu says that the Yi does concerning the way of heaven and earth, it is still impossible to get to the ultimate point. Distant is taken for its aspect that it is so wide and remote that it is impossible to reach it. Fine is taken for its aspect that it is so recondite and fine that it is impossible to perceive it. So that's 21 to 27. I stopped here because there are a number of references in the text that we should probably take a look at, but also see the transition as well. In 9 to 20 we were saying that if you name or label something or designate it or identify a source for it, it's not the greatest, right? It's some sort of exclusionary thing that's more limited. And now we're going over and saying, we're sort of giving terminology here, like ways of explaining it, and what these particular labels, like what aspect of this greater beyond or great mystery, what aspect of the mystery these particular terms reference. And what we're going to find is later on, it's interesting because here we have these particular terms and what they mean in relation to the mysterious. But then what we're going to see is some of these terms are not, they're kind of mutually exclusionary, or they they cancel each other out. They're opposites in some sense. And so it's funny because, if you can describe something as both great and small, what are you saying? It's sort of a mystery. But in a sense, both the term great and the term small may be appropriate in describing this. So I think that's a point that we're going to get to soon. But here we're laying out the initial terminology that is later going to be played off against each other. So I don't really need to repeat what was said here in terms of what Dao means or what dark or Xuan means. But you can see here that if you wanted to go over it, what he means by each term. I will say that he mentions yarrow stalks and tortoise shells. These are, divination methods. Tortoise shells, I don't know if everyone is familiar with that. I did a space on a Xi Wang Mu, the Western, Queen Mother, sort of a mythological character, and I gathered up all of the pre-unification and some Han Dynasty material relating to the Western Queen Mother. And I made a space of that. It's recorded. I threw it up on YouTube as well. But actually, these tortoise shells are extremely ancient, going back to the Shang Dynasty. And the first suspected reference to the Queen Mother of the West appears on one of those tortoise shells. It actually doesn't have the Wang in there. It just says Xi Mu. And there's also a Dong Mu. So there's a Western Mother and an Eastern Mother. But these tortoise shells are usually something like they take the shell of a tortoise or a turtle and they'll write something on it like, this is the date today. We are going to go hunting. What are we going to catch? We want to catch this. And they'll crack it and they'll read the lines and then they'll write, okay, the prognostication was good. It looks like we're going to catch everything we want to catch. And then the last bit will be something like, okay, it was awesome. The prognostication came true and we did catch 2 deer and a donkey or whatever. I give a little bit of a better description in the other recording, but you can see it's sort of this divination tool where they were able to ask questions, crack the shell, read the shell, go out and do the activity, and then write the results of the activity on the shell and then bury them. Well, I don't know if they purposely buried them or not, but people dig them up. It's a very, very, I think the most archaic form of Chinese writing that we have. The arrow stalks here. I've got the character on 25 is the E. That's the character that gets usually translated as change, like the Book of Changes, or the Zhou Yi or Yi Jing. And again, I don't want to get too much into that and go off track, but he's referencing both prognostication, but also, in the first space we mentioned that Wang Bi and these other people put together different texts, including a commentary on the Book of Changes and a LueLi on the Book of Changes. They believe that there is metaphysical significance to the structures described in the Book of Changes and to things like the use of yarrow stalks. So it's not like taking the auguries. Like if a Roman took the auguries, you see where birds are, or a Hellene or something takes the auguries. The use of the Book of Changes for prognostication and the like isn't so much just bare, but sort of like a happenstance of seeing a bird and not having a description of how a bird weighs into the metaphysical structure of reality. But the Book of Changes and the hexagrams and the like, in their opinions at least, really were of metaphysical significance, whereas seeing a particular magpie or something, or flocks of birds, maybe is not like that. Whereas hexagrams kind of, and how these things play out, is sort of written into the fabric of reality. But basically we're getting the terminology here, what it means when used in reference to this mystery, the Xuan or the Dao, and then I think what we're going to see is how they play off against each other. So if anyone has any comments, or is maybe someone here who really knows a lot about the Book of Changes, if anyone wants to comment, I'll give you a moment to request a mic or put your hand up. Otherwise, I will continue.
I like how he was pretty much putting the example of what he had described earlier in the in being fast, you must not be slow. And I think we see that a lot in the metaphors that he gives us there, the comparisons, because, in order to be deep, it must not be able to be, the bottom be reached. I liked that. And as far as the predictions go, I know there's 4 classifications of the different methods. I know it's random, randomized, human, and then I'm forgetting the last one right now, but the Roman augury and the I Ching are both in different classifications.
Yeah, I think, I haven't read Wang Bi's work on the Book of Changes, but I've read sort of quotations from it, and actually if you read the LaoZi Zhu and if you read some of the surrounding material on this text we're reading today, sometimes the way it gets interpreted or the way we understand it will draw upon his work elsewhere, like on the Book of Changes, and it'll kind of inform how we read him here. Because he wrote a great amount on that book, and it really is a lot different than just looking for a chance sign in nature. There's a whole study to the hexagrams and how to structure reality, and it's got as the Sizi says that the E does concerning the way of heaven and earth. You wouldn't really say like the auguries when you see birds that the birds are doing anything concerning the way of heaven and earth. It's a whole metaphysical system, and there's a longer discussion of that for people who are interested. And there are actually a lot of people, it seems, in the West at least, that are interested in the Book of Changes, and I think maybe his work on that would be even more interesting to them. Just picking up a copy of the Book of Changes without the appended essays and without any sort of later commentary seems kind of foolhardy to me. And I can't pretend to have read any long detailed commentary on it, so that's kind of why I'm hesitant to say more about it. Other than that, there's a lot more to it than just taking the auguries or cracking a tortoise shell. But yeah, I'll go to 28 now, so we'll continue on, and I'll end at 32. Thus of the words Wei, dark, deep, great, fine, and distant, each has its meaning, but they do not exhaust its totality. Thus, it is impossible to give to that which one fills in and rounds out evermore, without getting to the ultimate point, the name minute. It is impossible to give to that which is fine and subtle and without form, the name great. That is why, well, I'll just cut it at 31, because this is a point I was making. Oh, I see someone requested a mic. Well, I'll just finish this point. You can see here, actually on 28, it says, thus of the words Wei, dark, deep, great, fine, and distant. I don't know why on 28 he translated it as Wei, and on 22 he translated it as Dao. But as you can see, these words match up, and the Dao of 22 is the Wei of 28. And then when I was saying that these words are going to be played off against each other, just quickly, it's illustrated right here at 30 and 31. So it is impossible to give to that which one fills in and rounds out evermore the name minute. So if it's so great that you can never complete it and round it out and fill it up to completion, how can you call it minute or small or fair or fine? Like this is great. It can't even be filled in. But then in 31, it's saying, how can you call that which is fine and subtle, which is referencing words like a dark. You'll see the word recondite and the like. These are fine and subtle. How can you call that great? So it's like you can apply Dao to this thing, you can apply dark to this thing, but yet what is Dao, what is great, how could it be what is fine or small or subtle? And what is fine and small and subtle, how can it be great? So these words are kind of hard to hold in common together, but yet they both apply to it. I will... Hold on, who's requesting the mic? Let's see. Broad Street, I'll approve. Let's see. There you go. Broad, did you have anything to say or add? I think I hit approve rather than cancel, But well, Broad, if you want the mic again, just request it. Maybe I hit the wrong button, but I'll pause, and if you have any questions or comments, I'll pick it back up. Did anyone else have any comments on this section 28 to 31? It's a very short section, but I just think it's interesting how he's defined all these terms, and then he's given us a very clear example of how these two terms seem to be contradictory, but yet they're being applied to the same thing. Oh, there we go. Hold on. I'll give it to you again, Broad. There we go. It should work this time.
Yeah, I had to leave and rejoin the space entirely. My comment was about the Book of Changes, so I'll let you finish with this, and then I can ask you about that.
Oh no, go ahead, please. I think when you I just very quickly finished up the comment I wanted to make there, which was just in 30 and 31, we've taken those terms that he's defined, and then he's given a very clear example of how the terms can be applied to this same thing or this same metaphysical structure or source, and yet they seem contradictory. So it's sort of an interesting point that these seemingly contradictory terms are properly applied to this same system or source or mother. But please comment on the Book of Changes. Pretty much anyone knows more about it than me. I really haven't read too much about it.
Well, I have the Richard Wilhelm translation, which was translated into English in the 50s. I know there are, I think, two more that were published in the 90s that became popular. I haven't read them. One of those, I think, has more information from archaeological findings and things like that. So I didn't know if that was something you might include, or if you do hold a space, I wouldn't mind participating. I read all the commentaries when I was learning it. I don't pay as much attention to it anymore, but it would probably be interesting for me to revisit that.
Did you, you said you read all the commentaries. By that, do you mean the essays that were appended on the back? Did your copy have
there's two sets. There's footnote commentary and commentary throughout each regular section, and then, yes, I would reference the second set of commentaries. I can't remember what he called them.
They call them the wings. I've seen them called the wings in English translations.
Well, if you read the whole thing, he mentions something specific. So they're almost like a point and counterpoint. The comment, because if I remember correctly, the German gentleman who translated them was working with his father. It's been a long time since I've read these portions of the book. But he was trying to honor certain things that were conveyed to either him or his father in the original set of translations. And so Sorry, I was getting a call. I'll have to call him back. The second set of commentary was him delving in further on his understanding at the point where he was writing, rather than trying to remain faithful to whoever had taught them and originally translated them. And I'm referring to the original German translator. The English translator just kind of conveyed that. But the original German translator, again, was either working with his father or somebody his father had known that taught them.
Okay, I gotcha. So sort of a modern commentary and take on it as well, and not modern in a bad sense. I mean, it's a unique commentary or take on the text from these individuals that were familiar with it.
Yes, I mean, since that would have been 1934 or thereabouts.
Gotcha.
And I do remember that reading the second set of commentaries would sometimes illuminate further and sometimes just lead to more questions.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing I need to read is a commentary from a much later author, because all I've read from the Book of Changes, I mean, I read some of the original material itself, although it was never a huge interest for me. And then the some of the wings, like I've read the Xi, for example, years ago. It's, I wouldn't say it's definitely not like a line by line commentary of the Book of Changes though. But something like what you're describing would probably be useful for me at some point if I revisit that text, because just like we have the LaoZi Zhu here and the LaoZi WeiZhi LueLi, it's an author who is summarizing the text, and an author who's going line by line and providing detailed commentary, that if you don't have that, it's so easy to just have a very uninformed interpretation, I suppose.
Well, I've played with that text enough that I don't remember all the commentaries, but I gained a fair degree of understanding of how to use it and what it does, along with other things I did in my early 20s. So I added you for notifications on all tweets. So if I see you do that space, I'll make sure I join.
Perfect. Indigo, I saw you had your hand up briefly, but you put it down again, so I don't know.
Yeah, I found the framework for the different prediction systems. So the 4 different are random, randomized, human, and non-random. So the Roman augury would fall under the random, which is something spontaneous that happens. Randomized requires a human input, so that would be the I Ching. So you have a human that initiates a process, and then you look at a certain set of outcomes that can come from that. Human is something more like a diviner, where they're receiving a message or an input from a higher source and then conveying it. And non-random would be something that happens regularly, like, say, astronomy or something.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. The, sort of part of what I was thinking when I made the distinction with the augury was, I don't know how deep or systematic the thinking was about the birds, like why they fly a certain way. I think maybe in my childish imagination, you see some birds fly up at the right time and you think, well, it's a sign from the gods. But I don't know if the god doing that is is saying anything metaphysical about the structure of reality. Whereas if you are throwing these yarrow stalks or doing whatnot with hexagrams, you're not referencing a fickle god so much. Well, I don't want to call them fickle. I'm sure the gods are very good. You're not referencing an entity like the gods. You're sort of referencing almost like the system or the structure behind reality, which it doesn't make it better or worse than the gods. It seemed like another distinction to make.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have quite a bit of information on that, but just for the focus of the space, we can go into that another time.
Perfect. All right, yeah, and I think both you and Broad are right. It would be an interesting topic for another space, and I'd have a lot to learn because, again, I'm no expert on how to deal with the Book of Changes. But let's go 32 to, let's see. 44 is a long set. All right, let's just do. Where is 44? Okay, so I'll do 32 to 44. It's a long passage. That is why the LaoZi chapters say, I give it the style Wei, and I designate it the dark, but no name is given. Thus, he who talks about it misses its all under heavens eternal. He who gives a name to it becomes separated from its, all under heavens, true nature. He who interferes with it destroys its, all under heavens, nature. He who holds on to it loses its, all under heavens, source. That is why the sage does not take words as the master, so that he does not deviate from its, all under heavens. I'm going to stop saying all under heavens. Does not take words as the master, so that he does not deviate from its eternal. Does not take a name for the eternal, so that he does not become separated from its true nature. Does not take action for his business, so that... There's a typo there. Does not take actions for his business, so that he does not destroy its nature. Does not take holding onto for control, and thus does not lose its source. Hence, he who imposes discursive analysis upon the particular textual patterns of the LaoZi will miss what he points at, and he who wishes to put the weight on the particular term under consideration will deviate from the LaoZi's overall meaning. Thus it is the LaoZi text's great purport to expound the source of the great beginning in order to elucidate the nature of that which is of itself what it is, and to hold forth on the ultimate of the recondite, in order to settle the delusions of doubt and deception, to respond to, and not to act upon, to adapt and not to initiate, to emulate the root by way of bringing to rest its outgrowth, to keep to the mother by way of maintaining her offspring, to hold lightly indeed skill and arts of government as a means to control the people. Act, well, they have not now come about, not to make demands on others, but necessarily to make all demands on oneself as the Lord. These are his, that is LaoZi's, key points. That was a very long series of sections there. But actually, it's, again, we have reached another stage in the text, so we're really actually moving forward here into something new. So what happened in the last section we had a definition of terminology. We had this observation that although the terminology seems to be in some sense mutually incompatible or contradictory, it still is somehow applicable to this Dao or this Xuan or this great thing that's behind all. And now we're going into, well, I guess from 33 to down to 43, we're really getting into some more political advice. It's like if you spend all day talking about it, you're going to miss it because you're, focusing on a particular term, focus on another particular term, rather than the whole system in total. If you give a name to it, it becomes separated from its true nature. Again, these are points that were made. I mean, we saw this being made right at the beginning of the second chapter. Does not take actions for his business so that he does not destroy its nature. Again, these are all observations that were made earlier in the text and are about not being so focused on specificity to the which involves exclusion and which therefore involves falling short of this source or mother or Tao. But yeah, that was a really long chapter to go over. I would highlight section 44, that last one there, because, well, 43 is also interesting because, remember, this is a LueLi or Li Lue, and we described in the first chapter sort of the purpose of one of these texts, and what was the purpose, right? It's there's been this long history of commentary, I suppose, and part of it is summarizing, part of it is putting all the, pulling out all the crucial ideas from a text, summarizing them in a clear way, and then piecing them together into a framework and sort of illuminating or explicating that framework so that the text as a whole can be systematized and understood. And Wang Bi here in 43 and 44 is really speaking to that purpose directly. So what do we have at 43? He's like, if you are going to read the Laozi in a certain way and impose discursive analysis upon the particular textual patterns, you'll miss what you're pointing at. And if you put weight on the particular terms, you'll deviate from the overall meaning. We went more into this in the first chapter, but there's a long history of commentary by the time of Wang Bi. And one style of commentary that he would have been familiar with is really focused on etymology. There's a lot of ancient texts pre-Han, and then in the Han dynasty, people would take great amount of time to figure out exact definitions or unique or obscure definitions for rare characters or important characters of the Chinese language. And then maybe that is a criticism of that. If you put the weight on a particular term, you'll deviate from the overall meaning. If you're so focused on teasing out the etymology of every word that LaoZi writes, if you're so focused on understanding obscure characters, like maybe you have 10 different characters for different mountain formations, and so you think you can go in and give the etymology for each one and say, this character is about a tall mountain, this character is about a broad mountain. He's kind of missing the overall point. So I see that 43 as he's now getting into speaking directly on how we should interpret texts, which is really what the LaoZi WeiZhi LueLi is about, right? And then at 44, we have almost like a really clear summary of what he thinks is going on with the DaoDeJing. So he's gone from this sort of almost internalizing his reading of the DaoDeJing and representing it to us in his own writing, and now to directly saying, yep, this is the purpose of the DaoDeJing. Thus it is the LaoZi text's great purport to expound the source of the great beginning, in order to elucidate the nature of that which is of itself what it is, and to hold forth on the ultimate, etc. So he's like, yep, this is the purpose of the DaoDeJing. To respond to, and not to act upon. To adapt, and not to initiate. So that seems to be a very crucial section 44 right there, in terms of the actual project of this essay. Now, I prefer the parts of the essay where he's internalized it, and is presenting it as a brand new essay or work. Well, obviously it's referencing all these texts, but it's kind of a brand new work. Whereas 44 really seems to be something that is different in its flavor. It's sort of like, this is the purpose of that text. These are the lessons I took from it. Done. So it's interesting 44 there, kind of carving out his position. And what we'll remember from the first chapter, or the first space that we did, I mentioned that Wagner provides us with a section from a Tang Dynasty commentary on Wang Bi, where he describes the purpose of a LueLi or Li Lue, and one of the purposes he says, one of the purposes he assigns to that sort of project is identifying opposing interpretations and criticizing them. So what we're going to see next, in 43 and 44, we had, this is how you read it, this is the purpose of the DaoDeJing, here's the chief takeaways, that's what LaoZi really meant. 44 pretty much ends with, these are his key points. That's what LaoZi meant. And now 45, we're going to go into the criticism and identifying of other positions, other interpreters. So now the text has taken on really another development. It's like a new stage in this text. And it's kind of, we have been identifying these different focuses or different stages in the chapters. There's going to be a brand new stage, I suppose. Before I go into the identification and criticism of other schools, does anyone have any comments to make or anything of that nature?
I'm okay, thank you.
All right, I'll just go right into it. We're going to go to 45. And remember, he's just said, this is the purpose of the DaoDeJing. This is what it's all about. That's what LaoZi's main point was. And now 45, we see, we'll go from 45 to where does this end? 57. So, but the legalists promote equality and equality, and then apply punishment to supervise them. The name school promotes the fixation of the true and then uses terms to rectify them. The Ru school, or Confucian school, promotes complete love and then uses praise to drive them on. The Maoists promote parsimony and simplicity, and then use constraint to fixate them on this. The eclectics promote all sorts of treats and use a variety of means to let the people act accordingly. It is a fact that, when punishments are applied to supervise beings, craft and deceit will inevitably arise. Names are used to make beings orthodox. Order and consideration will inevitably be lost. Praise is used to drive beings on. Competition will inevitably arise. Enforced reform is used to settle beings. Heresy and rebellion will inevitably ensue. Mixed treats are used to make beings act. Defilement and chaos will inevitably ensue. All these schools make use of the offspring, but discard its mother. Beings lose... Well, is this a typo here? Okay, beings lose what supports them and cannot be guarded. Alright. And actually, if we went back... That's 57, so I'll stop there. If we went back to the first recording, you recall that a large part of the research or background for this text is about the style of writing and how it's laid out and why we see the different columns. I went into a little bit of detail and gave an example from the text. So if you already heard that, great. If you haven't and you're wondering about why it's written in this style with different columns and numbers, go back and listen to that, I suppose. But look at 51. It says, it is a fact that when, and then 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, and 56. You would repeat 51 for each one. I didn't, but let's repeat it as an example. It is a fact that when punishments are applied to supervised beings, craft and deceit will inevitably arise. Then we go back to 51. It is a fact that when names are used to make beings orthodox, order and consideration will inevitably be lost. Then we go back to 51, and then we go to 54. Then we go to 51. Then we go to 55. And so, it reads a lot better, actually, I think, if you do that. But, and that's sort of how it's meant to be done. But, and again, with 45, you do 45, 46, 45, 47, 45, 48, 45, 49, again. But I guess that's stylistic, and maybe I'm just complaining because I'm the one who had to read it out. But I don't know if people here are familiar with all these schools. We saw legalists, we saw the name school, we saw the rule or Rujia or Confucian school, we saw Morjia, or I don't even know how the English name is usually pronounced, Mohists or Moists, and then the eclectics. Ancient China, especially pre-unification China, is very famous for having a large number, 100 different schools of thought, right? And these are just a few of them. Whether ancient Chinese people actually organized themselves into these different schools, that's another question. But certainly by the time of Wang Bi, they recognize these particular schools. Again, 3rd century AD. Fall of Han, Three Kingdoms period, really. So there's a huge number of schools. And at least by Wang Bi's time, they recognize people as having been organized into them. He doesn't single out them all. He just singles out 5 of them here. I don't know if anyone is familiar with many of them. I can give a brief description. I'll make a brief description of a couple of them, I guess. But I like the structure here. In 44, he said, this is how you read the text. This is what Laozi really meant. And now I'm going to go down the list, and I'm going to identify these different schools of thought that have interpreted this text or written commentaries on this text. And I'm going to say, you're obsessed with equality and equality. You're obsessed with fixing names and making things logically coherent. You're obsessed with a family hierarchy and focusing on love and praising people. So he's identifying each one of them. And then he's saying, but your obsessions or your focus, it causes these other problems to occur. And in identifying these traits or qualities of these schools that defines these schools, isn't he kind of going back to what we read earlier, which was sort of if you focus on a particular title or a name or a thing, it excludes other things. And so perhaps these various schools in their focus exclude other things and don't get the whole truth. Now, I'm sure they'd give plenty of responses, but maybe that's maybe that informs the style of critique here. Trying to look at some of these here. Well, let's read. I'll leave it for now. Let's read down to 69 because he continues this assault. So we got the legalists, the name school, the Confucian school, the Morjia or Moist school, and the eclectics. And he said, you are each focused on these things. And then he says, being focused on these things, this negative thing results for each one of them. And then he gets down to here, and he says at 58, however, the destination of the various arguments is the same, though the ways are different. The various arguments' meanings coincide, but the approaches vary. But the scholars from the different schools are bewildered as to their argument's common destination. They are befuddled as to their common amount. When they observe them, some of the arguments in the LaoZi, advocating equalizing, they style him legalist. When they perceive them delineating the true, they style LaoZi a member of the name school. When they observe them, the arguments in the LaoZi, advocating pure love, they style LaoZi a Confucian. When they perceive them, the arguments in the LaoZi, advocating parsimony and simplicity, they style him a Moist. When they see him advocating unsystematic tenets, they style him an eclecticist. According to what their eyes happen to perceive, they assign a Chinese reading of the DaoDeJing. Name, depending on what they like. Sorry. That's actually the title of the book there. I'll go back to 69. According to what their eyes happen to perceive, they assign the name, depending on what they like. They cling to the meaning. That there are confused and faulty exegeses and struggles between different tendencies and interpretations is caused by this faulty methodology of other scholars. Alright, actually I guess I should have read that all the way through from 45 to... 69 is actually the very end of it. What do we see in 46 through 50? These are the schools. These are their particular teachings or things that they focus on or their methods. And then what do we get? We get, given that this school has this particular focus, this bad thing arises for each one of them. And then little do all of these schools know, but their arguments are all directed to a common thing. And their arguments are all coming from, the same place. They're all referencing the same thing, but they're particularized. They have their particular focuses, and it's causing them to be confused and gives rise to all sorts of bad results. And then he really illustrates this. It's like if a legalist sees the LaoZi talk about equality or egalitarianism, he's like, oh, those people just think that LaoZi must have been a legalist. And then if someone from the name school sees LaoZi, assigning accurate names to things and just delineating the true, they just say, oh, LaoZi must have been part of the name school. And then if some Confucian comes along and reads the DaoDeJing, he's like, oh, he's talking about pure love and family hierarchy and the like. He must be a Confucian. So each of these different schools is fixated on their own particular obsessions or styles or methodology. And whenever they encounter a text like the DaoDeJing, they just latch on to that aspect of the text and then interpret it all in that accordance and make him theirs. Whereas, really, I guess what Wang Bi is getting at is that you cannot latch on to a particular to the exclusion of other things. You have to understand the broader picture. It's like, he who wishes to put the weight on the particular term under consideration will deviate from the LaoZi's overall meaning. That's 43. And so down here, if you're putting the weight on the equalizing or egalitarianism and making LaoZi into a legalist, you are, 43, deviating from the LaoZi's overall meaning. So you can see how he has criticized these schools as reading themselves into the DaoDeJing and then reinterpreting the DaoDeJing in their own, image, which he thinks is kind of perverting the text or improperly converting it to another way of thinking. Broad, I see your hand is up.
Well, it's just a wonderful commentary on human nature, right? Because we see that across the board in every era, obviously, but in our modern world with modern ideologies and belief systems as well, that the capacity to project your own understanding of the world on what somebody else is presenting based on a really cursory interpretation. And so that I just found that a really good description. That's why I wanted to speak up.
Yeah, I think I really like this section of the text. It's I don't actually necessarily agree with Wang Bi's way of treating these other schools. I'm sure that everyone in those particular schools would be up in arms. Because in a sense, isn't Wang Bi also himself having a position on the text? Although maybe he thinks he's gone beyond that and he's not fixated on particular terms. But yeah, you're right. We all kind of have this. If we have a book that's very famous or that we like, we want to sort of read it in accordance with our beliefs, or at least make it harmonious with our beliefs, or kind of convert it into our understanding, I suppose, rather than have to admit that this very famous or important text or book is not in line with our thinking, or we are not in line with it. So I suppose there's always that temptation. You know, I was reading this and I pulled it reminded me of a meme about Alexander the Great, so I went and found it. Hold on. Which is not about a text, but it's about a person, but I think it illustrates that desire to make something famous or important or significant yours, in a sense, or bring it in line with your thinking, even if it may do damage to the text or the figure's history. But here's the meme, and maybe you guys have seen it. I'll just read it quickly. It looks like an excerpt from a book. "Everyone here always mentions Alexander," I said with a laugh. "It's incredible how many places he stopped on his way east. Half of Central Asia says they're his descendants." "Alexander the Great was an Uzbek," a voice behind me said, in perfect English. It was the only other customer in the shop, a tall, dark man in expensive jeans and a leather jacket. "I'm not sure the Greeks would agree," I said. "Yes, he was an Uzbek," the man repeated confidently. "He was actually called Ishkandar, and his grandfather was also Uzbek." "Well, that's certainly news to me," I said, "and I'm sure it would be to most Greek historians as well." The man was undaunted. "The Greeks were also Uzbeks," he said. "There were originally 3 types of Greeks, and the black Greeks were actually Uzbeks." So there you have is a meme. It's not exactly on point, but essentially everyone wants Alexander the Great to be their own, right? And so he's made Alexander the Great an Uzbek, just like these legalists, these Mingjia and Narujia and Morjia, and you know they've all made the DaoDeJing their own sort of fellow text in their school of thought. So I thought that meme it definitely reminded me of that. That's actually the end of the second chapter. I think it's covered a lot of ground, and some of it brand new from the first chapter. Like, we started out in a place where, alright, it's essentially political advice, just like we saw in the first chapter. And then we get to, okay, we're giving the terminology. So now we're going to do a bit of definitions here. Then we get another interesting description of the Dao or the Xuan, where he's saying these terms that we've defined and that are appropriate to attach to it are actually seemingly contradictory, even though they all apply to it. And then we go straight into the next stage, which is how to properly interpret the text and what Laozi's real intention was. So he's gone from the philosophy into speaking about the text itself and the author itself as he understands it. And then he's gotten into sort of a literary criticism, or like an interpretation criticism, of all the different famous schools that he's most familiar with. Again, there are many other schools, like he doesn't mention the Nongjia, the agriculturalists or anything, but yeah, he's gone straight into textual interpretation and analysis and criticizing other schools, which we didn't see I don't think we saw that in the first chapter. So he's kind of putting his foot down and saying, like, I'm the correct interpreter, and those who interpret this text while focusing on their loyalties to legalism or names or whatever are going to miss the point. I guess we can almost end it there unless people have comments. I'll add a little bit about the schools because, again, I don't know how familiar people are, but let's see what we got here. Legalists and names. Okay, so there's a famous story, legalists and name schools. You'll find it in the Hanfei. Hanfei is a legalist thinker. If you guys are familiar with 5th century Hellenic philosophy, the sophists, the name school are sometimes compared with the sophists. I don't want to say they're example. I don't want to say they're identical or they're the same, but there's a certain reputation that they do share. So, for example, you may have heard of a white horse is not a horse. That's a famous a discussion of logic, essentially. What's it from? I think like the Gongsuan Longzi or something. But the essentially it's a famous argument, logical argument regarding a white horse is not a horse. There are others as well. There's a bunch of them. But these people, the person who put forward that argument that a white horse is not a horse is from the name school. And it was very famous. And again, you can kind of imagine why he was perhaps regarded as Plato regards the sophists, trying to make these semantic distinctions and troublesome arguments that are perhaps not in good faith. Now, I'm not making a judgment as to whether the name school, these people were in good faith or not, and I don't think that Plato is particularly in good faith either. But the legalists here are a particularly, I'll say, brutal and amoral sort of... they're very focused on how to govern a state and organize a state, and they're trying to end this huge war that is tearing apart the pre-unification Chinese world. And obviously, if they're trying to organize society and make very clear laws and standardize everything, they're going to be annoyed by a sophist who comes and picks apart their standardizations and their systems and tries to flaunt their rules. And so in the Han Feizi, you'll find this story where the name school, that figure, he comes up with a white horse is not a horse. And Han Feizi is like, all right, whatever. You can come to the court of a king or an emperor, and you can make this beautiful argument about how a white horse is not a horse, and maybe you'll overthrow us all and we won't be able to properly interpret your point, or we can't refute it, or you've categorized things in a way that it does make sense, and therefore cause problems for our seemingly clear legal code. But after we leave the courthouse, or leave the the court, the area where the king and his ministers meet and hold court, after we've left for the day, and you need to go home and leave the state and go back to your state in another kingdom. Of course, China at that time was many kingdoms. You're going to get to the border, and the border guard is going to say, it looks like you have a horse, and you need to pay the border tax. And when you tell the guard, well, this is a white horse, it's not a horse, he's just going to draw his sword and he's going to say, you've got a horse, you need to pay the horse tax. And you're either going to pay him the tax, or he's going to cut you in half. And this stupid argument about a white horse being a horse is really not going to get you anywhere. So legalists were very practical. They wanted to build this very effective and self-regulating machine of state. That's at one school. And they focused on applying punishments, but also rewards to motivate people, but they were very severe. And that was sort of their goal. And then the name school, not really famous as organizers of great nations and making this great machine a state and military force, but more about discussing logic and these distinctions. And there's also a movement in ancient China which I would not really apply to any particular school. Actually, the legalists do this just as much, but is correctly labeling things. So not using multiple terms for the same thing in ways that could be used to create contradictions or semantic problems. But there you see sort of a famous story involving the legalists and the name school, sort of how they differ in their view of the world. The name school definitely seems to be these sort of independent philosophers going around discussing logic and coming up with all these distinctions and system making on a philosophical level. And then you have these legalists whose focus is really public administration and the building of a very powerful military and a very powerful self-regulating government structure. And if some sophist wants to come in and describe that, oh, your horse tax won't work because a white horse is not a horse, they don't really have patience for that. Because their goal is not to have patience with that. They're not really interested in, well, maybe they are philosophically, but they're not, it doesn't affect the administration of the state as to whether you can recategorize white horses and horses, but rather They just want to have this very well self-regulating system where the border taxes are collected and the administration moves forward. And sophists, insofar as they obstruct that, are going to get hurt. Yeah, that's an example of two schools there. We all know the Ru school or the Confucian school. Morja is, again, we all kind of know that. And eclectics by that Wang Bi is, I suppose, just highlighting any people who kind of crossed over different schools. So you have certain figures who, are often thought to be just like a jumbled bunch of different philosophies all put together. I saw Broad put his hand up. If you want the mic, Broad, I'll let you speak. Otherwise, I may well just end it there. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and Chapter 3 will be next. It's a much shorter chapter. Chapter 4 and 5 also much, much shorter. And then 6 is going to be an absolute sort of mammoth of a text, but maybe 1.5 times longer than what we had today. But otherwise, we will be at the end, and we will have all read Wang Bi's The Structure of the LaoZi's Subtle Pointers. But Broad, please, go ahead.
I'm just transitioning network, so I had to drop to listener because I lost you. I'll let you end it there. I don't know if you meant the recording or just the chapter, but I notice you're recording this space, so I'll eliminate my unnecessary excessive commentary that I often contribute. I had something that was way off text, and please don't ask me to, because I think it would take you down a side channel that would wind up being recorded. So
no worries then. I'm sure we'll discuss it in some other place or some other time. But thank you everyone for being here. That's the end of the second chapter. Covered a lot of ground, some of it the same or in the same line of thinking as the first chapter, but also some genuinely new stuff here. Like, this is what the Laozi really means. This is how you read a text. And all these particular schools, they're all fixated on their own worldview or own motivations or methodologies. And in being fixated on their particularities, it causes other problems, and they all kind of miss the point. And only an unbiased and neutral scholar like Wang Bi can truly grasp the overall meaning, I suppose. Anyway, I'll end it there. Thank you again, and hopefully I'll see everyone again next week. Bye.